Howdy folks, and welcome back to Armoured Warfare with the mighty Jingles. Today it's tank review time once again, and we're dispensing with all of that Western muck, and we're taking a look at some Soviet hardware. This is the T-80 main battle tank, Soviet Tier 7 main battle tank, and it's the second Tier 7 main battle tank that I unlocked in Armoured Warfare, with the first being the mighty Challenger. Now I do love the Challenger. I think it's a great tank. It's simple, effective, very easy to use. But I prefer the T-80. The T-80 is not an especially badly armoured tank, but it's nowhere near as tough as the Challenger. Heck, most things aren't as tough as the Challenger, but what the T-80 has in spades is speed, mobility, and lots of firepower. While the Challenger just kind of sits there, takes the hits, and steadily chips away at its opponent's health, the T-80 is all about getting there as quickly as possible and doing the maximum amount of damage in as short a space of time as possible. So what we're going to be doing today is taking a look at the T-80, having a look at the upgrade path, what kind of retrofits you should install to it, which commander you are going to want to use on it, and then we're going to run it through a few missions, and we're going to talk about the development of the machine. So you unlock your T-80 from the T-72A. How are you going to go about prioritising the upgrades for this fantastic tank? The first thing I would recommend you do is make a beeline straight for the fire control system. This reduces your aiming time by 20%. That's a big old boost. You're going to find that very useful after suffering through the horrible aiming time on tanks like the T-72 and to a lesser degree the T-72A. You'll notice that there are a lot, and I really do mean a lot, of firepower upgrades on this tank, because that's basically what this tank is all about. Now you might be thinking, oh great, so it's going to suck at first and end up being really good later on. Actually, no. A stock T-80 with the default gun and the default ammunition actually has better firepower than a fully upgraded Challenger 1. Fresh out of the factory, this 125mm smoothbore gun does 509 average damage and has 435mm of penetration. Compare that to the best ammunition available on the Challenger: 438 damage, nearly 100 less, and only 423mm of penetration. Of course, the Challenger does have a faster reload, and it's very accurate, but it's not that much of a faster reload, and the damage output of the T-80 just keeps getting better and better as you unlock new guns and new ammunition, until eventually a fully upgraded T-80 is doing about 1,000 damage per minute more than a Challenger, and they're both Tier 7 main battle tanks. And the firepower extravaganza doesn't end there, because the T-80, like most of the Soviet tanks and some of the German high-tier tanks, also gets the option of firing anti-tank guided missiles from its main gun. And have a look at the penetration on that thing. That's nearly 1,000mm of effective penetration and a metric arse ton of damage. But before you start getting too carried away with the possibility of just vaporizing everything with these anti-tank guided missiles, remember they're shaped charge warheads. And don't forget, you're at Tier 7 now, and most of the things that you're going to be firing this kind of ammunition at is going to at the very least have composite armour, which is highly resistant to shaped charge ammunition. And in the worst case scenario, it's going to have explosive reactive armour, cage armour, or even active protection systems, which are going to completely nullify this kind of ammunition. And speaking of which, that brings us onto the T-80's armour. Now, it's certainly not a badly armoured tank, but it's definitely no Challenger. The T-80's armour is a layered steel composite. There are no armour upgrade packages for this tank. What you see is what you get. The effective thickness of the armour on the turret front against armour-piercing ammunition is 405mm, and on the hull 372mm. But that's against armour-piercing ammunition, and this is layered composite armour, so it's going to have more resistance against shaped charge ammunition like anti-tank guided missiles, and it does, but it's not that much more. 675mm of effective turret frontal armour against shaped charge ammunition, which means that the turret front of the T-80 would be more than capable of bouncing almost every kind of high explosive anti-tank ammunition, but would be penetrated by the missiles fired by the T-80 itself. How about the Challenger? The Challenger against armour-piercing ammunition has 676mm of effective armour on the turret front and 651 on the front of the hull. This is of course with the oblique armour package fitted. So the T-80, even with its best armour-piercing ammunition, wouldn't be able to penetrate the front of the Challenger at all, unless it managed to find a weak spot. But what about those ATGMs with their 977mm of penetration? Nope, sorry, still not going to happen. So yes, you do get a lot of penetration on these anti-tank guided missiles, but they're definitely not an I win button. They have to be used against the right target. So once you've got the fire control system and all of the ammunition for the T-80 unlocked, that's when I recommend you go for the engine upgrade. Now there is only one engine upgrade, and looking at the stats of the stock engine, it doesn't actually look that good. 6.75 seconds to reach 32 kilometers per hour. That's actually slower than the upgraded Challenger 1, and the Challenger 1 is certainly not famous for its maneuverability. And yet the numbers don't really tell the whole story, because while the Challenger should reach 32 kilometers per hour, slightly faster than a stock T-80, the Challenger takes about a week to get up to something like 50 kilometers per hour, and the T-80, even with the stock engine, just keeps motoring on through. So you're going to want that engine upgrade, because it is definitely going to make you faster from a standing start, but it's definitely not going to be top of your list of priorities. And finally, it's also worth mentioning that the T-80 is where you unlock the Mark III version of the braided Kevlar wiring retrofit, and once unlocked on the T-80 you can fit it to any of your tanks. This increases your crew skills by nearly 5%, and also gives you a 12% bonus to any component saving throws. What the hell is a component saving throw? Well, basically if your tank gets hit and penetrated, any equipment components that are in the line of fire have to make a saving throw to determine whether or not they're completely knocked out, and the braided Kevlar wiring gives you a bonus to that saving throw. And speaking of retrofits, that's what we're going to take a look at next. Now, the T-80 only has 3 retrofit slots available. It has 1 universal, 1 firepower, and 1 mobility. Which basically means it's got 2 firepower and 1 mobility, because this tank is nothing if not all about killing things very, very quickly. You basically want to fit things that are going to help with your aiming time, your reload, and increase the damage that you do. And that's why I've gone with gyroscopic stabilizers, which reduce my aiming time and reload, and experimental propellant, which increases the damage that I do. This is not rocket science. Now when it comes to the mobility retrofit slot, you've got a couple of options, but what I've gone for is the advanced supercharger. It doesn't just increase the top speed of the tank, it also gives a significant boost to the whole traverse speed. Now that doesn't mean that the T-80 is slow to turn. It isn't, it's actually pretty quick. But the thing about the T-80 is what armour you have on this tank is very much all at the front. This isn't like a Challenger, which also has very, very strong side armour as well as ridiculously strong frontal armour. And being able to get the hull of this tank turned around and get all of that frontal armour pointed at new threats that pop up has saved my ass on more than one occasion. And that's why I've gone with the advanced supercharger. Now, when it comes to selecting which commander to use in this tank, there are a lot of bad choices and only a couple of good ones, but I think the best of the bunch is Juan Carlos Miramon. He's a Mexican tank commander, and you can unlock him for just a fraction over 12,000 reputation points on the Tier 4 artillery, the Gvozdika. Or, well, I don't know, you pronounce it, I don't know. Why Juan Carlos? Okay, good question, well asked. It's all about the skills he gives you. At rank 1 you get quick swap, which improves your ammo swap speed by 20%. Okay, that's not very good. But at rank 2, you get the option of training a skill which reduces your aiming time by 10%. Okay, that's starting to sound actually pretty good. At rank 3, quick relocation improves your acceleration speed in off-road environments by 15% for 15 seconds after firing. So, ambush, shoot and scoot, lie in wait, pump a shot into a target and do a load of damage because you're in a T-80, and then get the hell out of there before they fire back. At rank 4 you can choose either anti-material or anti-personnel explosives, which are going to increase the amount of module or crew damage caused to enemies by 20%, and then at rank 5, fire when ready, reload time reduced by a further 6%. And this is pretty much why I use Juan Carlos Miramon on just about every main battle tank that I own. He's just a really, really good main battle tank commander. Now when it comes to picking crew skills in the T-80, your choices are pretty straightforward because this tank only has 3 crew, a commander, a gunner and a driver. There is no loader in this tank. The T-80 comes with an auto-loading mechanism. Now that means you can't pick any crew skills that are going to boost your reload. That's why it's always a good idea in Soviet and Russian tanks to go for commanders and equipment retrofits that help with the reload of the main gun. On my driver, I've gone for off-road driving, 10% better acceleration in off-road terrain. I've also gone for spin to win, further increasing the hull traverse by 10%. My gunner, once fully trained, has quick draw, improves his aiming time by 10%, and do the twist, get that turret pointed at the target 10% faster. And that's pretty much my T-80. This is the second Tier 7 main battle tank that I've unlocked in Armoured Warfare. I've also now unlocked the T-90, and it's even better than the T-80. I love the Challenger, of course, which was my first Tier 7 main battle tank, but the Challenger's pretty simple. It's like Tier 7 main battle tanks for dummies. Lots and lots of armour, you don't really have to drive it that carefully, And when it comes to firing at the targets, there's only really one ammunition choice on the Challenger, the armor-piercing, fin-stabilised, discarding Sabo, because it's that or Hesh, and the Hesh is pretty terrible. So the Challenger is a very, very simple tank to drive. The T-80, not so much. You can't rely on the armour as much as you can in the Challenger, and you've got armour-piercing, fin-stabilised, discarding Sabo ammunition, you've got high-explosive ammunition, high-explosive anti-tank ammunition, and anti-tank guided missile ammunition. So there's a bit more thinking needs to be done in the T-80 in order to get good results, but you can definitely get good results in this tank. So let's fire up a couple of missions, and then we'll talk about how this tank came to be. The T-80 is a little bit of a mystery tank. Unlike the T-64 and the T-72, no official history of this tank has ever been written, although there are several unofficial histories, and until very recently the tank was still under development in Russia, and I think it's still under development in the Ukraine, so there is an element of secrecy that still shrouds certain elements of this tank. Nevertheless, we do know certain things about it. The T-80 was supposed to be the ultimate Soviet main battle tank. It entered service with the Soviet Union at around about the same time tanks like the Challenger, the Leopard and the M1 Abrams were entering service with NATO. Unlike these NATO tanks, however, which were new designs, the T-80 isn't really a new tank. Instead, it's more of an evolutionary upgrade over the T-64A. What made things even more difficult than they needed to be for the developers of the T-80 was that Russia was actually running, ironically enough, anything up to 4 different standard tanks at the same time. The T-64A, the T-72, the T-80 and the T-90. In this atmosphere of fierce competition between various different Soviet tank design bureaus, the T-80 wasn't really helped by the fact that it was ridiculously expensive compared to tanks like the T-64A and the T-72, and it wasn't really that much better than them. And the main reason why the T-80 was so horribly expensive compared to its competition was because it didn't have a diesel engine, it had a gas turbine engine. The whole idea of using gas turbine engines to power tanks began to attract some attention in the mid-1950s. Gas turbine engines are basically jet engines, and the successful use of gas turbines for helicopter propulsion sparked some military interest in their potential application to tanks. The main attraction of gas turbines was that they offer very, very high power output from a relatively small and lightweight engine. Soviet investigation into gas turbine powered tanks began in 1956, but several experimental efforts in the early 1960s led to widespread skepticism within the Soviet army, because while offering excellent road speeds, the gas turbine had a ferocious appetite for fuel. It averaged 240 kilograms of fuel per hour, compared to 83 kilograms per hour for a comparable diesel engine. The other significant problem that became very apparent early on was that, well, driving a helicopter isn't quite the same as driving a tank, and the existing air filtration systems down at ground level were completely inadequate to protect the gas turbine engine from dust ingestion. Or to put it more simply, with these early gas turbine engines, they sucked in so much dust that before too long, erosion would lead to the engine chewing itself apart. In 1967, SP Izatov's design bureau at Leningrad was ordered to develop a gas turbine engine optimized for tank use. From the very beginning, they decided that the engine had to be designed from the ground up and not simply base it on a helicopter engine, as they had done in the past, because a tank engine suffers from substantially higher shock loads in use due to rough ground and the jolt of gun detonations. As well as this, the Army wanted a monoblock engine, or a power pack. This is an engine which contains not just the engine itself, but the air filtration system, the transmission, the compressor, the oil pumps and other engine accessories that could be removed from the tank as a single unit. This new GTD1000T engine was first mounted in a tank chassis in May 1969. This engine was first placed in a modified T-64 tank chassis known as the Object 219. Naturally, there were some teething problems. The metal tracks and metal road wheels of the T-64's suspension caused such extreme vibration at high speed that it actually limited the speed at which the engine could be run. So, new suspension had to be designed. Dust ingestion remained a serious problem, so a completely new air filtration system had to be designed. They also came up with the idea of installing rubber side skirts on the tank. You may have seen pictures of Soviet tanks with rubber side skirts and thought to yourself, well, how the heck is that ever going to stop a tank shell? That's not what they're for. They're actually there to help reduce the amount of dust that gets sucked into the engines when the tank's travelling at high speed. Troop trials conducted in 1973 did show that the potential of gas turbine engines in improving tank mobility compared to the T-64 was there, but the engines failed to reach their design objective of 500 hours operating life. As late as 1972, only 19 out of 27 engines reached even 300 hours of engine life. Troop trials in 1974 and 1975 confirmed that fuel consumption was very high and engine reliability was very, very low. The new tank needed external fuel drums to even meet its basic range requirement of 450 kilometers. Fuel consumption was still anything from 1.6 to 1.8 times higher than the T-64A. At the time this was going on, the Soviet tank industry was behind in its production program, partly because of problems with the T-64A and T-72 programs, but at the same time they were also trying to produce more T-55 and T-62 tanks for export after the shockingly high Egyptian and Syrian tank losses in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. In November 1975, the Minister of Defense, Marshal Andrei Grechko, completely rejected a plan to place the Object 219 into production, citing the fact that it consumed twice as much fuel as the T-64A and offered no benefits in firepower or armour. And that may very well have been the end of the Object 219, or as it would become known, the T-80, if not for the death of Marshal Grechko in 1976 and his replacement by Dmitry Ustinov. And Dmitry Ustinov really liked tanks with gas turbine engines. And so on the 6th of August 1976, the Object 219 was suddenly accepted for production under the Army designation of T-80. In its original configuration, the long-delayed T-80 was basically just a very expensive T-64A. It had exactly the same firepower, it used the same type of turret with an optical rangefinder, but it was hideously expensive. It cost 480,000 rubles compared to 143,000 rubles for the T-64A. In respect to its turret and fire controls, it was already behind the Kharkov-designed T-64, which had evolved by 1976 into the T-64B, with a new fire control system incorporating the laser rangefinder and the capability to fire the Cobra tube-launched guided missile. With the exception of Defense Minister Ustinov, nobody was very enthusiastic about the T-80, and so the initial production run only lasted 2 years. And it's been estimated that overall T-80 production was probably well under 200 tanks. Certainly west of the Urals, there were never more than 112 at any one time. But with Ustinov still insisting that gas turbine-powered tanks were the future, work began on developing the T-80B. As well as incorporating the ability to fire the Cobra anti-tank guided missile, the Object 219R, as the prototype T-80B was known, also involved the latest generation of Soviet laminate armour on the turret. This was codenamed Combination K, and incorporated a cavity in the cast steel armour of the turret front, which was filled with a matrix of ultra-porcelain ceramic rods. Combination K offered protection equivalent to about 550mm of steel in the turret front. The glacis plate used a different type of laminate armour, consistent of an outer layer of about 80mm of steel, backed by 105mm of glass-reinforced plastic, followed by a 20mm steel armour base, offering protection equivalent to over 500mm of steel, including its steep slope. The Object 219R was accepted for Soviet service in 1978 as the T-80B and entered production in the same year. The T-80B became the most common production version of the T-80 and the first version to be forward deployed with a group of Soviet forces in Germany starting in 1981. The T-80B was first seen by NATO moving into Germany in April 1983, beginning with the 29th Tank Regiment, 9th Tank Division of the 1st Guards Tank Army, and with units of the 8th Guards Tank Army in 1984. Meanwhile, in Israel, strange things were afoot. During the 1982 war in Lebanon, the Israelis used tanks fitted with explosive reactive armour, or ERA, for the first time in history. The first generation of ERA was designed to defeat high-explosive anti-tank shaped charged warheads. Shaped charged warheads are different from normal high-explosive warheads in that the explosive is actually shaped, hence the name, around a metal cone at the front of the warhead. When the warhead detonates, the explosive collapses the metal cone and forms it into a narrow stream of metal particles travelling at hypersonic speeds that can punch through huge amounts of conventional steel armour. The ERA bricks each consisted of a metal box at a shallow angle to the likely path of attack. The box contained plastic explosive and a steel plate. When the ERA brick was struck by a shaped charged warhead, the plastic explosive detonated and propelled the plates into the path of the shaped charge's penetrating stream, substantially degrading its effectiveness. Soviet scientists had already developed dynamic protection in the 1960s, but there hadn't been much interest in deploying it by Soviet commanders. However, the appearance of the Israeli Blazer ERA in 1982 renewed Soviet Army interest and led to a crash program to deploy it on Soviet-made battle tanks, especially those forward deployed in the group of Soviet forces Germany. The new Russian ERA was codenamed Contact. It's been estimated that Contact would degrade a typical 125mm missile warhead by as much as 86%, a 125mm high explosive anti-tank projectile as much as 58%, and a 93mm infantry light anti-tank weapon rocket by as much as 92%. It was a bit lighter than the Israeli Blazer, and they claimed it was about 15% more effective. Contact began to be fitted to Soviet tanks in 1983 and was first deployed with a group of Soviet forces Germany in 1984. In 1985 they began to manufacture the T-80B with Contact as the T-80BV. The V part of the designation is just the first letter of the Russian word for explosives, which I couldn't even begin to pronounce if I tried, and trust me, I did try, and it just sounded, well, bad. so I'm not going to do it. Now, the Soviet Army did push Contact 1 into service almost immediately, but it wasn't completely popular with the Soviet tank designers because it added 1.2 metric tons to the weight of the tank, and it was only able to protect against shape-charged warheads. By the mid-1980s, NATO was shifting its tactics towards the use of armour-piercing, fin-stabilised, discarding sabot ammunition for tank guns, which were completely unaffected by Contact. The Soviet Army managed to get some examples of Israeli M111 AP FSDS 105mm ammunition from the Syrians that had been captured in the 1982 Lebanon War, and tests of this ammunition in the Soviet Union indicated that it could penetrate the existing glacis armour of tanks such as the T-72 and T-80. As a short-term fix, 20mm of steel armour was applied to the T-80B glacis plates. In addition, accelerated research was begun on a second-generation universal ERA called Contact 5, which was intended to have some capability to degrade AP FSDS projectiles as well as shape-charged warheads. Contact 5 relied on a much more substantial steel plate on the outside of the panel, and this material was sufficient both to increase the degradation of shape-charged jets and also degrade AP FSDS penetration by about 20 to 35%. The new Contact 5 panels also included around about 20% more high explosive and had to be angled properly for maximum effect, and in combination with their size and weight, they couldn't be bolted on, as had been the case with Contact 1. Contact 5 had to be incorporated as a comprehensively designed armour package that would have to be undertaken during either original manufacture or during capital rebuilding of existing tanks. And this is where you get the T-80U, which was built with a comprehensive Contact 5 protection package. Russian sources claim that the Contact 5, as well as the new turret armour developed for the T-80U, provided an unprecedented amount of protection, equivalent to 780mm against AP-FSDS and 1,320mm against high explosive anti-tank in the turret front. It was undoubtedly the best Soviet tank of its day, but it came at a very, very high price. A study concluded that the T-80U was about 10% more combat effective than the T-72B, but cost nearly 3 times as much, 824,000 rubles, compared to only 280,000 rubles for the T-72B. Soviet tanks received a very, very bad reputation after the poor performance of cheap export models of the T-72, the T-72M, in the hands of the Iraqi army in the 1991 Gulf War. However, the T-80U and the T-72B represented a fundamentally different capability, having substantially better armour and better ammunition. US Army live-fire tests against ex-Soviet tanks obtained in the 1990s concluded that NATO would have had a very hard time penetrating the advanced armour arrays deployed on the T-80U and T-72B, and likewise their ammunition was substantially more potent than the cheap export rounds that were exported to Iraq. The T-80 still had that really expensive turbine engine, however. In the 1980s, the V46 diesel engine on the T-72 only cost 9,600 rubles, while the GTD1000 turbine engine on the T-80 was more than 10 times more expensive at 104,000 rubles. As well as this, it had a shorter running life, it consumed more fuel, and it was complicated and expensive to maintain and repair. But Defence Minister Ustinov still insisted that turbinisation was the way to go for Red Army tanks. His views were not universally shared by the Red Army, however. A Defense Ministry study in 1984 concluded that for the next 5-year plan the Soviet Army could purchase 2,500 tanks and 6,000 diesel engines, or 1,500 tanks and 2,000 turbine engines. Ustinov decided that they could have the 1,500 tanks and the 2,000 turbine engines, and they'd better be damn well grateful for them. And then he died. And his body was barely in the ground when government approval for a diesel-powered T-80U was granted on the 2nd of September 1985. The original plan had been to designate this diesel-powered T-80U, which was going to be built at the Kharkov plant, as the T-84, following the Kharkov tradition of the T-34, the T-44, the T-54, 64 and so on and so on. This proposal led to a bitter fight between the industry and the army, with some detractors noting that the T-84 designation would draw attention to the fact that the Soviet army was operating 4 different standard tanks, the T-64, the T-72, the T-80 and this new T-84, all with essentially the same characteristics except for 4 completely different power plants. The issue was so contentious that it actually went right to the top, Gorbachev's Central Committee of the Communist Party, for a final decision. In the end, the less conspicuous designation, T-80UD, was selected, indicating improved diesel. Soviet tank production, however, continued to decline in the late 1980s due to Mikhail Gorbachev's attempts to rein in defense spending. Total production of the T-80UD prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union was pretty modest at around about 500 tanks, of which the majority, 350, were still located at the Kharkov plant when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. At the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the T-80 was the premium tank of the Red Army, deployed with the very most combat-ready of their ground forces. When the tank did actually see combat for the first time, however, it would not live up to its reputation, although this wasn't strictly the fault of the tank itself. The attempted secession of Chechnya in the Caucasus led to Russia's most protracted and bitter war of the 1990s. There weren't actually any T-80 units in the Transcaucasus military district at the time of the Soviet breakup. During the build-up in 1994, prior to the assault on the Chechen capital of Grozny, a number of T-80B and T-80BV tanks were taken out of depots and handed over to units that hadn't received any training on the T-80. Unfamiliar with the appetite for fuel of the T-80 turbine engine, crews left the engines running at idle, not realising that the tank consumed as much fuel at idle as it did when running at full speed, and they totally exhausted their fuel supplies. The bulk of the T-80BV tanks in Chechnya actually came from units outside the region, and at least 2 of these units, the 81st and 129th Guards Motorized Rifle Regiments, didn't actually have the explosive cassettes for their contact reactive armour. During the assault on the Chechen capital on December the 31st, 1994, tank units were ordered into the city without adequate tactical planning, and with crews ill-trained to carry out their mission. The result was a slaughter. About 70% of the 200 tanks involved in the attack were knocked out. Russian newspapers and television were full of pictures of destroyed T-72 and T-80 tanks. One T-80BV of the 133rd Guards Separate Tank Battalion suffered 18 RPG penetrations and lost a track to a mine. At least 17 T-80B and T-80BV tanks were lost during the fighting around Grozny between 1994 and 1995. It was singled out by its opponents due to problems with its expensive turbine engine, its high fuel consumption, and the vulnerability of its ammunition carousel to catastrophic detonation, although to be fair this was a problem with the T-72 as well. Many Chechen fighters were former Soviet soldiers and they were very familiar with Russian tanks. Although the T-80B was very well protected against the RPG-7 anti-tank rocket from frontal attack, its Achilles heel was the upper surface of the engine deck, where a well-aimed rocket fired from a tall building could penetrate the thin armour and then pass through the unarmoured firewall between the engine and fighting compartment, striking the ammunition around the turret. This would spark a chain of explosions of the tank propellant, causing the tank to lose its cap. In a speech at the Kubinka Armour Centre 2 months later, Defence Minister Pavel Grachev blamed poor Russian tank design as one of the causes of the whole Chechen disaster. These criticisms diverted attention away from the real causes of the fiasco, including poor troop training, incompetent tactics and poor operational planning by senior Russian army leadership. The head of Russian tank development, Colonel General Alexander Galkin, continued to argue that the T-80U was a superior design to the rival T-72B. Once again, the fate of the Russian tank program was going to be determined by politics rather than technology. Having been the past victim of Kremlin politics, the plant responsible for production of the new version of the T-72, known as the T-72BU, decided to rename it the T-90. And thanks to some vigorous campaigning by the governor of the region where the factory was located, the Russian army announced that the T-90 would be the preferred tank for the immediate future, and not the T-80. The decision didn't actually make any difference whatsoever in the short run, because there was just no money for either the T-80U or the T-90 for almost 10 years. Russian state orders for tanks wouldn't resume until 2005. In the meantime, however, there was always the export market, but the Red Army's stated preference for the T-90 didn't help the T-80's export prospects. Remember, the T-80U was significantly more expensive to purchase and operate than the T-72B. It was also facing some stiff competition from the Ukrainian Kharkov tank plant, which was offering the diesel version of the T-80 on the export market. Whether the T-90 was favoured or not, by the late 1990s the T-80 was the backbone of Russian tank forces. Older tanks had been retired due to lack of funds, and of the 5,546 tanks still in service west of the Urals in 1997, 3,210 were T-80 tanks, almost 60%. A handful of export orders for the T-80U did materialise, although they were fulfilled mostly by using undelivered equipment from the Omsk plant. Morocco bought about 5 T-80s in the late 1980s, ostensibly for testing for a future tank requirement, but it is widely believed that they ended up in the hands of American, British and German intelligence agencies. Russia sold Britain one T-80U in 1992 as a goodwill gesture connected with President Boris Yeltsin's visit to Britain in 1992. Sweden evaluated the T-80U for its tank competition starting in 1993, but finally settled on the German Leopard 2. The Russian government owed South Korea a substantial amount of money from the Soviet period, and partly paid these debts through the sale of military equipment. The Republic of Korea Army received about 80 T-80U tanks from 1996 to 2005. These are used primarily by opposing forces units for training. Cyprus acquired 41 T-80U tanks, including 14 of the new T-80UK command tanks in 1996 and 1997. There have been attempts to push the T-80 in new directions, such as the Object 477 Molot or Hammer, which was an attempt to build a T-80 with an unmanned turret and a 152mm cannon. More recently, there have been other projects such as the T-80 Black Eagle. Although owing to the bankruptcy of the Omsk plant that was developing the Black Eagle project, it was cancelled, and a production version of this prototype tank has never been publicly demonstrated. So, that's the T-80. Despite the introduction of the T-14 Armata, still likely to be the backbone of Soviet ground forces for many, many years to come. And which version of the T-80 do we have here in Armoured Warfare? Well, pretty easy to work it out. It doesn't have explosive reactive armour plating, so it's not the T-80BV or the T-80U, and it fires missiles, so it's not the T-80. It must therefore in fact be the T-80B. Doesn't mean we can't see other versions of the T-80 in the game in the future. That's the T-80, Soviet and now Russian Tier 7 main battle tank here in Armoured Warfare. Follows on from the T-72A and leads on to the equally good T-90. Hope you enjoyed today's video, folks, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.